go get food. But we have Michael, and we have Michael, and I'm Mohammed. 3M's, taking care of business today. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are on Instagram? Just raise of hands. Awesome. About 20 of you guys here. That's pretty cool. Well, follow us, Boston Startup Org. So that's Startup Boss Org when you get a moment. Or we can take a minute now. No, I'm joking. No, we're going to get started. Yeah, but please follow us on Instagram, Startup Boston Org or Boss Org. You'll find us. Our media team is doing incredible work, reels, and your faces might be in it. So you'd love to see yourself. I know. All right, let's get started. Thank you again for attending the 8th annual Startup Boston Week. My name is Mohammed, and I'll be your host today. And a huge thank you again to Suffolk University Sawyer Business School for hosting this conference and just throughout the week. They did it last year as well, so we thank them. So let's just give them a round of applause. Suffolk hosts a lot of great opportunities for both learning in and outside of these classrooms. We really do appreciate their partnership and all that they've been doing, hosting the entirety of Startup Boston Week, both last year and this year as well. And as you know, the goal of the Boston Startup Week is to connect the entire greater Boston area and all over New England. And as many of you guys know, I'm from Maine. I brag about it, but I'm here to join you guys. And it's amazing. All these industries, all startup departments, and all bootstrap and funding stages for the next 5 days, learning and connecting with one another. So the team that creates this, Boston Startup Week, are all volunteers. They're volunteering their time. So let's give them a round of applause as well. So again, thank you so much for attending this conference. It's a labor of love, and we do appreciate you playing a role in shaping this community. So let's hear it from Michael and Michael. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Mohammed, thank you so much. I'm Michael Kriegsman. I am the host of the CXO Talk video podcast. We have completed about 850 episodes on the topic of leadership, enterprise AI, and the digital economy. And we interview literally the most senior executives from the largest companies in the world. So it's an incredible repository. Check it out at cxotalk.com. And today we're talking about Series A, and I'm speaking with Michael Schrader. Michael, tell us about Vaxxus and tell us about your work.
Hi, everyone. Well, so nice to meet you all today. My name is Michael Schrader. I actually spun a company called Vaxxus out of my graduate school program. So I was an MBA student, a second-year MBA student. This was many years ago now. It was about 13 years ago that we started Vaxxus. Was fortunate to found it with a couple of other colleagues who were also grad students at the time. And really the core technology behind Vaxxus is we allow for patients to self-apply vaccines in the comfort of their home. So instead of a needle and syringe in the arm, we have a technology platform that allows us to move vaccines and other biological drugs into a patch. So think of a nicotine patch, but for vaccines and other products. We mail the patch to your home, you put it on your arm, you wear it for about 5 minutes, you take the patch off and throw it away, and you've gotten your vaccination. We've now expanded into a host of other drugs, such as GLP-1, the weight loss drugs that most folks are familiar with. Pretty broad platform there. So spent the last 12 years building that company and actually left the company in February. So happy to dig in and talk a little bit more about the company and the journey, but high level, that's where I come from.
Well, this is going to be a pretty interesting story, and I think you're going to find that this story is inspiring and heartwarming and motivating. But most of all, I hope that this story terrifies you. And so there's a lot to dig into. Now, before we start, just raise your hand if you are pre-Series A. If you have not raised a Series A, raise your hand. And raise your hand if you have raised a Series A. Okay. So there's a few. Raise your hands if you have raised a Series A. I see one. Okay, so you'll relate to the terrifying aspect of this. So Michael, you briefly described Vaxxus. How big is the company today? Let's just fast forward for a moment.
Yeah, so we've got about 50 employees today, split across 2 locations. So we have an R&D site in Cambridge, and we have a pilot scale manufacturing plant in Woburn, Massachusetts. So about 30 minutes outside of the city, and our team is roughly split between those 2 locations.
Before the Series A, just to help set the context, can you tell us about the company's focus and about your core business strategy?
Yeah, so give a quick overview on the technology. We started working on this technology in 2012, 2013. We lived largely on grants for the first 6 or 7 years of the company. So we've raised over $35 million in non-dilutive funding at this point. So grants from folks like the Gates Foundation, NIH, NSF, DARPA, NASA, Department of Defense, you name it. Essentially every organization that was interested in simplifying drug delivery or vaccine delivery, we went out and actively engaged, and we're fortunate to bring some funding in. So they allowed us to really, advance the science, pull it out of labs at Tufts and MIT over those first 6 or 7 years. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, and everybody cared about vaccines, vaccine delivery, vaccine access. So COVID obviously was a terrible thing for everyone. It was probably the single best thing that could have happened for a company like Vaxxus that was in this vaccine delivery space. And I hate even saying that, but it was kind of the honest truth. And then all of a sudden you now had, vaccines from obviously Moderna, BioNTech, others that were worth hundreds of millions, if not billions, or hundreds of billions of dollars, and all of a sudden the amount of money flowing into this space really amped up. So that was kind of an inflection point for us around 2020, 2021 when COVID hit, allowed us to grow the company.
Was it COVID alone that enabled you to get that Series A? Or set the stage for us on what were the conditions that enabled you to develop the confidence of investors so you could raise that money?
Yeah, so it's such an interesting thing. When we first started the company, we essentially had a very clear message. We're going to move vaccines out of the clinic and into the home. And quite frankly, nobody believed that message. They didn't believe the FDA would allow it. They didn't believe that you could kind of trust patients to safely administer these in the comfort of their own home. They didn't believe we could answer questions like, how do you dispose of the patch afterwards? What do you do if a patient wears the patch for 2 minutes and it falls off, right? Do they have to then go get another patch? How do you ensure patients have actually gotten their vaccine, right? Clearly very important. So we had all of these different questions that I think a lot of people believe would be roadblocks that we could never overcome. And then when, COVID hit, I think what triggered for a lot of people was it really a mentality shift from these are insurmountable problems to, okay, these are real problems that we have to come up with creative solutions to, but it's a problem worth solving, right? We saw with COVID a pandemic that altered all of our lives. Candidly, come from the infectious disease world, we expect more diseases like COVID to arise over the course of the next few decades. So we've got to start putting our heads together instead of just complaining about all the reasons this will never work, to thinking about all the different ways that we can solve this. So we as a company really morph from a company developing a drug delivery system to a company developing this entire platform that included everything from, how do you provide instructions to patients that are simple and easy for them to understand? Do you use video instructions? Do you use written instructions? How do you think, again, about disposal on the back end of these devices? We had to think about even the sales process, right? So traditionally you'd go into a doctor's office to get a vaccine, and now we're thinking about selling these on Amazon. So how do you think about engaging companies like Amazon, educating patients? So we really went from a device company to a total system company. I think that was the leap that enabled us to get over the hump. And we had a number of investors we had been talking with for 5 or 6 years that had been very cynical on these problems. And again, when they saw this mentality shift and they saw the rise in interest around COVID, I think that was enough to push them over the hump and say, okay, we'll now come in and commit to supporting this company.
So for you, would it be fair to say that COVID was the enabling factor or the condition that drove your investors to invest? Or would you have been able to raise the money, the Series A, without COVID?
Yeah, I think we would have gotten there eventually. I think what likely would have happened, which was kind of an inevitable shift, is we would have had to look beyond the vaccine space, right? So the name Vaxxus came from a combination of vaccine and access. So we had a mission from day one of improving vaccine access. And I think that mission was important to us as founders. It was important to our employees. And so we really were dedicated to that mission, right? The reality is the amount of money in the vaccine space is always debatable. The amount of money we're now seeing in the weight loss drug space or monoclonal antibody space or enzyme space or hormone space, all these other fields was astronomical from the start. So we have now added on a second program in the weight loss area because of the amount of money available there. I think if we would have continued to struggle in the vaccine space without COVID, we likely would have just had to think differently about the types of products we're delivering with our platform.
So you had a solid business from the standpoint of raising money. COVID essentially accelerated it.
That's it, and brought interest to the space. The interesting thing, so much of this ecosystem is luck, right? So if you look at the world of venture-backed vaccine companies, at any given time, there are probably 10 to 15, right? And when COVID hit, the majority of those later stage 10 to 15 companies all went public at massive valuations.
Right.
So there was this inflow then of capital to the investors who had backed those companies. They now had to backfill those 10 to 15 companies. So there was also just this ecosystem element that was honestly just kind of pure luck playing into our hands.
What about the terms of your Series A? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we raised our Series A in 2021. It was a $35 million financing. It had two tranches. It had a $25 million upfront tranche and then a $10 million secondary tranche. And the goal for that was very clearly set. We had to go into patients and prove that we could deliver vaccines in patients and see positive results. So there was a very nice milestone. Assuming we hit that milestone, it would unlock the $10 million kind of follow-on financing. So that's how we structured it. I think terrifying part about raising that Series A for us is, prior to the Series A, we had been a 15-employee company. We had always been able to bring in grants to kind of keep the company moving forward. Once we raised that $25 million, the clock started immediately, and essentially we had to ramp up from 15 employees to 50 employees. We had to build a manufacturing plant. We had to, really schedule this clinical trial. So all of a sudden, the sequencing, the timing pressure, the urgency of everything to really deliver before we ran out of money took it to the next level. And it was a pretty terrifying experience, actually.
Okay, so let's parse this. So prior to the Series A, you have 15 employees. And what were your finances like at that point? I'm assuming, like most startups, kind of struggling for every dollar.
Yeah, it was. It was struggling to survive day to day. We probably had a $2 to $3 million annual operating budget. And so most of the employees, founders included, were working for below market rates because we were excited to be there. We loved what we were doing. We had built kind of a cool, funky culture, a lot of the things you see within the startup ecosystem. So we were able to keep that burn low. And essentially, I came from the kind of the business side. I had a co-founder who came from the global health and nonprofit side. And the two of us were really yin and yang. I was always focused on raising venture money. He was always focused on bringing in grant money. And, call it good luck, coincidence, whatever it was, it always seemed like when the money from equity investors dried up, he was able to bring on a big grant. And when the money from the granting organizations dried up, Gates Foundation, for example, had given us a fair amount of money to develop a polio vaccine patch. And then they changed their grant strategy and they decided polio is essentially all but eradicated in one country. So instead of funding next generation polio vaccines, we're going to go buy more refrigerators to try and build out the cold chain and really push to get to a point of eradication. So they basically pulled the plug on us and every other polio program they were funding. Fortunately, then we had other equity investors that were able to come in. So it was basically this yin and yang back and forth of equity versus non-dilutive, allowing us to stay alive. And we could easily cut budget at times if we had to go from 15 employees down to 10 or 12, to extend runway by 6 months. We had the ability to do that. Once we raised the A, a lot of that flexibility went away.
Okay, so there you are surviving and doing well enough to move to this next milestone. Suddenly, you have this money. And you mentioned that the clock started ticking. Tell us about that. Which clock exactly was ticking?
Yeah, so we had been given a very clear mandate, which was deliver phase 1 clinical data for a vaccine in humans. And for those of you who aren't in the life science space, I had no idea. I don't come from a life science background. I actually designed cars before Vaxxas. So I was off in no man's land with this. I had no idea how hard it was to actually get the FDA or convince the FDA that you should let us put our things into human patients, right? But there's a ton that has to be done in terms of animal studies. There's a ton that has to be done in terms of manufacturing, getting quality systems in place, just developing a regulatory strategy. There's all these different things. And they all have to be really perfectly synced up. And they all take a lot of very expensive, talented people to kind of figure out how to sync these things up. And so again, the pledge of funding was, here's $25 million today. When you come back and show us good phase 1 data, we'll unlock another $10 million that will extend the runway further and give us time to go raise a follow-on financing round. So it was really the clock ticking on that $25 million running out. And again, a lot of the grants we had been given were $2, $3, $4 million grants. Those had been enough to bridge us in the past, but once that burn rate spiked from $3 million a year to $15 million a year, all of a sudden a $3 million grant wasn't going to do much for us anymore, right? So that was really the clock that was terrifying.
But I have to imagine, though, that it must have been pretty incredible, because up until this point, you were kind of surviving almost by hook or by crook with various grants and having to suffer at the whims of changing funding priorities that have nothing to do with you. And then suddenly you have $25 million in the bank. So the first question I have to ask about this is, and you must tell the truth, what color is your Ferrari?
Yeah, that's the pipe dream. I joked with my wife. I graduated business school in 2012. I actually had a job offer that I accepted, and I was essentially working on Vaxxus up until the point when I was supposed to take that job. I backed out of that job offer. So finally, after raising the Series A, my salary finally hit the point that it would have been had I simply taken that original job offer and stuck with it. So it only took me 9 years to catch my salary up to what I could have been making otherwise. So this is a terrible financial decision. If any of you have any questions, there's no question on that front. But it was a little nicer lifestyle for sure that came because of that.
Okay, so now, all joking aside, you have all of this money, millions, tens of millions of dollars. I'm assuming at that point at work, life suddenly becomes easier. Instead of having a paper bag lunch, you have a nice meal, and right? I'm assuming.
There were nice meals. That part is true. Everything else is, was harder.
Everything else was, why was everything else hard? Now I'm absolutely confused, because you didn't have any money. And you're in business to make money, and now suddenly you have like tens of millions of dollars. How is it possible that life is harder?
I think we realized that everything was being held together by like shoestrings and rubber bands and duct tape, and then all of those systems just basically fell apart as we tried to grow the company. So, clearest example to me, we had no HR department. I was our HR department. When we had 15 employees, generally that worked. When we had 25 or 30, all of a sudden you have real HR issues that I am in no way qualified to deal with, right? So we had to find HR help. Our finance team, I was essentially our de facto CFO, even though I was completely unqualified to be a CFO. We had a wonderful bookkeeper who, again, had made sure that the bills were getting paid. All of a sudden that system was no longer working. Now we've got multiple different facilities. We've got, again, a much more complex payroll situation. We added in retirement benefits and things like that. So the financial complexity went up. So we had to go out and find a new group to come in and lead the financing team. All of our meeting structures essentially fell apart. Our meetings up until then had essentially been put everybody in a room together, and it was this very nice open dialogue and exchange, right? So if it's an hour-long meeting, maybe I present for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we would have discussion, and even the most junior team members felt like they could contribute to the discussion, and so we really all felt like we knew what was going on, and we all felt like we were involved in the decision-making. Well, all of a sudden now, when the all hands is 50 employees, typically it was me talking the entire time and everybody else just sitting there quietly in the audience. So all of a sudden we lost the feedback that had typically engaged from kind of, junior team members to me. And it became me just talking to people, which is far less productive. So we had to put in place a new meeting, structure to think about how do we make sure that information is flowing throughout the organization. I had previously had one-on-ones every month with every single member of the team. So again, a really important flow, both to know what they're doing, but also to get a sense for kind of culture, morale, how are people feeling about things? Are we at risk of, losing employees? And all of a sudden I didn't have time to do that anymore. So I felt very disconnected from the team. So it just went on and on, where all these systems that worked so well at 15 employees fell apart at 30 to 40 employees, and we really had to rebuild them. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, we ever got it back to being as enjoyable and engaging and, where everybody felt like a part of the team the way that it was at 15.
That's pretty interesting. So if I understand this correctly, you started out as a car designer, you moved into being a vaccine entrepreneur, you then shifted gears into becoming an HR specialist, and then you became, let's say, let's not call you the CFO, let's call you sort of finance intern.
Even that might be an exaggeration. I don't know. Yeah, so you see my trend in life is I will try to take on something new, and as soon as it starts to get really hard, I'll kind of run and bail and go do something else. So that's been kind of my core career journey idea.
All right, so you raised this money. What was the plan? Did you have a plan? How did you think about the resource allocations, your strategic focus? Did you think about that?
Yeah, so this is one thing that I think, because it took us so long to raise a Series A, we had to be crystal clear about exactly how much we needed, exactly how we were going to spend it, exactly how long things were going to take. So because it took us 2 or 3 years, every single assumption we had around that Series A was really pressure tested by investors. So that's a nice thing about, sometimes when it's challenging, when you see companies that come out and raise, $150 million in 3 or 4 months, I think oftentimes they haven't been forced to really think through a lot of those assumptions. So the plan was in place. The single biggest challenge for us was finding good people that were willing to come on board quickly and execute on that, right? And so I think this was the other shift, is when we had those initial 15 people, we all knew that at any time, we could be basically unemployed and back out on the market. When we got to 15 and we raised this money and then we had to go to 50, all of a sudden we needed special skill sets. So we needed a head of quality, for example. Our head of quality moved from North Carolina to Boston to be on our team. And he was fantastic, but he moved his entire family from North Carolina to Boston to be on our team. So the pressure I felt to make sure that this individual has kind of meaningful employment went through the ceiling, right? The expectations around that changed. And that was a kind of a burden that I didn't necessarily expect. And that was a lot harder to take on than I realized. You also had employees joining for, I'll say, different reasons. Those first 15 employees were there because they wanted to be at a cool company. Again, money was, we all needed a paycheck, but it wasn't the main reason we were there. We loved the mission. As we grew to 50, a lot of those folks came in and said, I'm being offered, X thousands of dollars by Pfizer. If you want me to come work here, I need the same offer. And how do you think about that, right? We need the talent, but we really can't afford to pay the same salaries as Pfizer. So, you just have this host of other myriad challenges that I think emerge around getting the people on board to really execute on that plan that was, I thought, pretty nicely laid out.
So there were impacts across the core operations of the company. When I say impacts, it sounds like, to use your term, like the wheels were falling off around HR, infrastructure. Tell us about office space, your marketing and sales, R&D and technology. Just in general, what were the tentacles of the growth, and how did it affect all these operational areas?
This is the other thing. So we were very fortunate to incubator hop early on in our life. So you talk about facilities. We were the first company in the Harvard iLab when it opened. And then we were the first company in Lab Central when that opened in Cambridge. And then we were the first company in the Harvard Life Lab, which was the kind of Harvard's version of Lab Central. So we literally just incubator hopped, and that worked fine with 15 people, right? We were able to make that work. All of a sudden now we had to go get our own space. We had to sign a 10-year lease for real estate. I don't know why any landlord thinks that asking a startup to sign a 10-year lease is good for business. It's just beyond me, right? There's no way we can forecast that and predict it, but there was a massive shortage of lab space, so we had to do it. So we have this 10-year lease. We're now, 3 or 4 years into it, so far so good. So that was a huge challenge for us, and again, a difference. We had to now go from living in an incubator where they take care of a lot of things on our behalf to setting up our own space. So we had to hire a head of facilities to come in and run that. So that was challenging. I think some of the other things that we struggled with, those 15 employees that were there in the beginning, 1 or 2 of them were in managerial roles. Most of them were individual contributors. And they were very good scientists, very good engineers. And now all of a sudden we brought in a wave of people below them. And guess what? They all become managers. And most of them are not experienced managers. And we didn't have any kind of a system in place to help train them to be managers, right? So now all of a sudden, this is the other element I didn't think about, is they were brilliant people. They were great engineers and scientists. Some of them could make that transition to leadership just fine. Some of them struggled with it, right? And so those are some of the systems that, again, you just kind of take for granted. So then you end up, in some cases, hiring in more veteran managers. Well, veteran managers can be great, but if they come from an organization like Pfizer, I know I'm kind of picking on Pfizer here, but if they come from a big company culture, let's just say that, it is a very different management style than what we had built up until that point at Vaxxas. So there were all kinds of conflicts there in terms of actually kind of building out a management team and training that management team while still maintaining some of the cultural elements of really kind of running fast, being not afraid to fail, being willing to break things. Those were some of the main challenges we crashed into.
And I have to imagine, especially coming from folks coming from large pharmaceutical companies who are have deeply ingrained in them this kind of risk aversion because they're, after all, it's the healthcare business.
Yeah, no, that was I would say the hardest part for us, but also a really good thing for us. They brought kind of a level of discipline and awareness that I was certainly naive of, right? And they were continually reminding us we are going into human patients with this. We are going into human patients with this, right? And so that was a really healthy thing, I think, for the organization. But on the other side of that, yeah, they were not used to meeting the kinds of timelines we had to meet with the reduced manpower relative to what they would have had at a Pfizer or other large pharma.
I think that's always very common when you're hiring people from large organizations who are used to having support staff and HR people and all of this stuff. As you were scaling the company, did that thinking ever really enter your minds? When I say you, I mean you and your management team, that as we hire folks from large companies, their expectations are going to be really different from what life has been like for us. And we're creating these systems that in a big company have existed maybe for decades.
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that you see these clusters emerge in certain ecosystems. So Boston obviously has a nice life science cluster. We kind of stopped hiring people from big pharma because it just didn't work, right? Again, they brought some valuable skills and knowledge and expertise. We had some senior leaders come in who didn't know how to use PowerPoint because they'd always had people on their teams to make PowerPoints for them. And so some of those things were very surprising to me, I will say. And so the joy of the Boston ecosystem, at least in life sciences, is we do have this wonderful cadre of individuals who are very experienced, but have basically gone from kind of 3 to 5 year stints in startup after startup after startup. We really started focusing our efforts on those folks, setting our sights on those folks, and trying to bring them in to some of those mid-level manager roles, as opposed to poaching folks out of big pharma ecosystems.
And I have to say, it surprises me as I meet with senior leaders from very large companies, and sometimes we'll be on a Zoom meeting and I'll say, oh, can you go into the Zoom settings and let me call someone.
Yep.
But what about metrics? Did you have metrics or KPIs or indicators of any sort in place in order to evaluate progress?
Yeah, so in the world of life sciences, again, I talked about kind of the syncing up of our animal studies have a certain pathway, our manufacturing has a certain pathway, our engagement with the FDA has a certain pathway, and all these pathways really have to sync up, right? So we do some early animal studies. Based on the data from that, we go talk to the FDA and we say, here's our plan for follow-on animal studies. Do you agree or concur? Yes or no? And then we go back into other animal studies. And so all of these things are very intertwined. And so there's a very nice linear flow for life science companies. What we struggled with was our early team members largely came out of academia. And so if we gave a timeline to them, we would often miss the timeline. And the reason was science is unpredictable, which is a very fair comment, right? Science is unpredictable. When we started to bring in some more senior leaders that had been in, again, largely small startups over and over and over again, what they said is, yes, science is unpredictable, but it's our job to spend the time upfront trying to anticipate the things we may run into and designing studies that can account for that. So as an example, if we're gonna run an animal study and we expect one of two outcomes to occur, good or bad, we should be able to look ahead and say, if bad, here's the next study that we'll run. And instead of waiting to find the outcome of study one to determine, or to run that study, we basically pull that study and we should be running it in parallel. So instead of maybe 3 different animal arms in our study, we now add on another 3 and we run those all in parallel. So if we get a yes, we know where we go. And if we get a no, well, we've already answered the next set of questions. And that allows us to hold our timelines. So it was really this mentality shift from science is unpredictable to we need to spend a lot of time up front mapping each of these out, spending time thinking about the outcomes of each study, what it could look like, and then making sure we are designing studies today so that we're already prepared for those outcomes before they come. So that was really the difference, and that's the joy of having money, is we had enough money to put more people and more resources and pay more for those animal studies so that we could now hold those timelines. But it was really a mentality shift that was tough for a lot of folks who had not been in industry previously.
Tell us about that mentality shift and how that came about, because I think this is a very important point, because it really marks an important transition between the startup mentality where we just by hook or by crook, we need to survive to live another day to a planning mentality and a scaling mentality of, hey, we're on a trajectory to actually accomplish something very meaningful for the long term.
Yeah, so there's so many examples that I think that the two clearest for us is first around the science. So many folks on our team had really measured their careers up until that point by publications, right? How many interesting scientific data sets have I generated that lead to publications? And when you kind of think in the world of publications, there's usually a kind of a break in between these, right? So I'm going to do this work, and then I'll publish it, and then I'll go do something else, and then I'll publish it. And again, now you've got all these flows that have to be synced up and flow together. You really have to coordinate better. And I think that's standard in any product development organization, where you kind of go from I'm in my little silo, getting the data set I need, to I have to be able on sync with all these other organizations. So that was one I think real shift in terms of the way we do science. The other change we made is prior to the Series A, we were willing to essentially take money from anybody who would give it to us, right? So we had a platform, we could deliver any biologic drug via a shelf-stable patch. So if you were going to give us money to go develop a polio vaccine, we would take your money and we'd go tinker on a polio vaccine. If you were going to give us money to develop some new mRNA vaccine, we'd take your money and we'd go develop an mRNA vaccine. And then, so that was kind of our grant strategy. That was a lot of our partnership strategy. And then we really shifted that mentality to say, okay, here are the products we think make the most sense. So the flu vaccine became our lead program. Instead of going to the NIH and saying, what are you going to give us money for? We said, here's the next 2 years of our flu product development strategy. We would like for you to fund X, Y, and Z. And sometimes they would say yes, and sometimes they would say no, but it was much more, all right, now we need resources to support what we know are the right next steps, as opposed to, we'll go do, whatever we can get paid to do.
But somehow things worked out. The wheels were coming off. All these systems were falling apart. You were the finance intern, and yet somehow things worked out. So what made it all work out? Because the company is still in business today.
Yeah, so I think there were a couple things. So we brought in a couple of wonderful senior leaders. One woman named Linda Tussey came on as our chief development officer. So she was essentially the head of our R&D team. She changed everything for us, and she knew, you could essentially she could develop a very crystal clear plan for any single vaccine to go from where we are today to phase 3 licensure FDA approval. And she could, in her mind, brilliantly think about all of these elements and how they should come together at each stage in a way that I've never seen. And every time she got data that changed one of those elements, right? So maybe the FDA told us something we didn't expect, she could, on the fly in her mind, again, revise all of these charts. So it showed to me the value of seniority. She'd been doing essentially vaccine development for 40 years. So get some of those senior leaders around the table. I mean, we had a lot of smart people. We didn't have anybody with her experience. So she was pretty transformational for us, one. And then I'll say, two, as an organization, we had a lot of growing pains where we had to have these cultural shifts. And I think one of the hardest experiences for us that I can talk about now that I'm gone, when we were in the push to get into the clinic, the last 6 months or so of getting into the clinic is just, it's incredibly daunting, right? All of these pieces have to come together perfectly. We had 3 different employees go on kind of medical leave for basically the stress of the job. And so that was a brutally hard thing for me as a manager, to know that we're pushing people that hard, that we've now got individuals who are potentially kind of going on medical leave because of the stress. It also was catastrophic because some of those were very important people to what we were trying to do. And so now all of a sudden we had massive talent gaps that, again, we had to fill at the last second. But what it spoke to ultimately, all of those employees ended up leaving Vaxxas. Some of them came back for a bit and then left Vaxxas. There was just this cultural shift within the organization from, we're kind of this fun academic-like research group to, we're now a product development group. And it's not necessarily going to be the same fun we had previously. Our fun is not going to come from tinkering and having fancy lunches. Our fun is going to come from hitting real milestones and hopefully getting products to patients. Some people like that, some people don't. So there was kind of an employee transition there. We lost some really, really smart people. It just wasn't, they weren't the right folks for that next stage of company growth. And that was really hard for me personally to accept. Maybe I'm a little Michael Scott-like for The Office, right? Like, I wanted everybody to be part of this big family, and it's just not it. Some people are better for that early stage stuff. They love the flexibility. They're willing to take low pay. They're just not right for later stage product development. And other people are a much better fit for that later stage product development. They don't care about Nerf gun fights. They want to get, human data.
Tell us about the expectations of your investors at this time, and how did that translate into how you ran the company and the impact on employees like you were just describing?
Yeah, so we were really lucky. So our main investor was a fund called RA Capital. For those of you in the life science world, they are the biggest crossover investor in biotech, which means they take a lot of private companies public, and that's kind of what they're built and set up to do. The investor from RA Capital who led the deal was a gentleman named Peter Kolchinsky. Peter founded RA Capital. The reason I love Peter and I had been talking for 5 or 6 years prior to them investing in Vaxxas. Peter came in and essentially said, here are the 5 reasons Vaxxas will never succeed. Prove me wrong, and we'll talk, right? And so, I would come back to him 2 or 3 times every year and say, here's our progress. He would always take my call, always willing to sit down with me. Just, we kind of slowly checked all those boxes, and, COVID hit. So those two things happened in parallel. But the beauty of that was that I had a very long relationship with Peter, and I knew very clearly what his expectations were for the company, right? And so when we took the money from them, we knew what to expect. It was what we thought was the best fit for the company, which was trying to push towards an IPO and making sure that we could really use this platform or leverage this platform across a lot of different products rather than just selling, one vaccine on our platform. So I think because I had that relationship with our investor, it made all this flow easier. And this is one of the biggest things that I think, I would encourage all of you to do if you're in the world of engaging with investors. You're going to get a lot of no's over time. Really, I would say place high value on those investors who tell you why they're telling you no and are candid and honest with you about the issues you're going to have with the company. I think that's Peter Kolchinsky's greatest gift is he's not worried about hurting people's feelings. He's going to tell people the honest truth about their companies. In some cases, it's I will never invest. In some cases, I don't think it's going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And so, when you find those folks, latch onto them, work with them, take their advice, and kind of build that relationship. In our case, again, it took 5 or 6 years before he ultimately cut us a check.
I just have to comment on this as well, that many VCs will try to avoid saying no. They don't want to give you that firm no. And I think being able to evaluate, as Michael was saying, the VCs that you're talking with to make sure that they'll be the right fit, that they're actually committed to you, that they're actually interested in what you're doing and will support you over a long term. Having worked with so many entrepreneurs, I just can't tell you how important that is.
When I hear that feedback of, oh, I love what you're doing, keep me posted.
Yes.
I'm not going to talk to you ever again. I have nothing to, I'm done with you, right? I'm not coming back to you because you are too, either you're not excited enough to tell me your honest, true opinions, or you're too afraid of hurting my feelings. I don't know what it is, but I'm never going to come back and pitch my company to you again. So that was kind of became our take on it.
Yeah. So when someone says, I love what you're doing, keep me posted, the translation is, you're dead to me. Unless something incredible happens where I think you can make me a ton of money, in which case I'll be your best friend.
That's it. When you strike oil, right?
Exactly.
I want you to come back and talk to me because I haven't offended you, right? It's
and I think there's also this element of personal chemistry.
Yeah, that's right.
VCs are people too. And some you'll like and some you won't like. And do you really, and it's hard, right? Because you've been working so hard to raise this money. And you can feel desperate sometimes, and you feel like you have no choices. And I'll just say, anything you can do to put yourself in the position where you have some choices, do it.
Yeah, we struggle with that. Most first-time founders do. Most early-stage startups do. I remember sitting in a business school class, and there was an entire class dedicated to how you, as an entrepreneur, should choose between this series of investors. And there were like 5 or 6 different investors with different profiles. And I am yet to run into a situation where a first-time entrepreneur has 5 or 6 different investors to choose from, right? That's just often not the case. So for us, it was really, we had 5 or 6 people that I felt like gave me candid and honest feedback, and I just did everything I could over those years to build that relationship with them, and then eventually we got there with one of them. But I think to your point, creating optionality is incredibly valuable. I haven't really figured out how to do it yet. So if anybody has tips and tricks on that, I'd be open to those. It's a really, really hard thing to do, particularly for first-time founders.
Also, this whole notion of being willing and able to accept feedback, difficult, painful. It's really easy. You go in and people say, well, love what you're doing. You're brilliant. And if any of you have started talking to potential investors, I'm sure you've heard that. And especially if somebody wants to acquire your company, even more so, you'll hear that. But it's the painful feedback. You will never succeed. This is a stupid idea, and I'm sure if you're raising money, you've heard this. Those are the people that are giving you the most valuable, truthful information, and just have a thick skin, don't take it personally. It's hard, but take that advice and learn.
It's such a good point. I feel like in the startup ecosystem, so our first $1.25 million all came from business plan competitions. We were masters of business plan competitions. Our claim to fame, which is now more of a claim to shame, is we're the only team to win the Harvard New Venture competition twice. So sounds like a great thing. We used to put it on all our slides, right? We won it in 2012 as a student team. We came back in 2013 as an alumni team and won it again. And I had one professor who just shook his head and he said, Michael, do you know why you're the only team to win it twice? And I said, no. He said, because every other team that won it once raised money and was ineligible to compete in future years. You were the only team that could not turn that win into real fundraising dollars, right? So now it's more of a claim to shame. But I think the reason I like to tell this story is because it is very easy to get a lot of false positives in this ecosystem, right? And in this case, it was kind of an academic environment. It was obviously a university business plan competition we were very good at. We later learned that not a single judge on either of those judging panels was from the life science ecosystem, so that helped, right? None of them could really criticize our work and really understood the science. But it gave us this false sense of, optimism. We went out into the venture community. We thought we were, the stuff, and then we're running into entrepreneurs who are on their third or fourth company, had a couple successful exits. We're competing for the same dollars against those people. So really, to your point, make sure you're finding those folks who are willing to give you true, honest, hard criticism, and don't get offended by it. Thank them for taking the time to do that, because it's not an easy thing to do if you're on the other side of the table either.
Okay, one more question, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So you folks, I'm sure you have questions, so start thinking of your questions. What did you learn from all this?
Yeah, so there's maybe two elements to that. So first, I learned for me personally, I love the 15 employee or less company. So I have actually left Vaxxus earlier this year, and I'm going to go start something new. And when it gets to 15 or 20 employees, I'm going to happily hand that off to somebody else, right? I think that there's just different people who kind of thrive in different ecosystems. I loved that 0 to 15, 0 to 20. So maybe that's more of kind of a personal learning for me. I think from a company standpoint, the biggest mistake we made was not hiring Linda Tussey as employee number one. Getting that veteran around the table, she changed everything for us. I grew so much, kind of working alongside her, learning from her. So I think one mistake we tend to make as younger entrepreneurs or first-time entrepreneurs is we kind of surround ourselves with peers or maybe people that we're not threatened by, maybe people, again, similar in age or experience level, because it's easier to relate to them. Get some folks around the table that have done this successfully over and over and over again, and shut up and listen. And that's something that I wish I would have done. I think we could have cut 5 or 6 years off of our company trajectory if Linda had come in earlier and I had just zipped my mouth and listened to the feedback she had for me.
People who are willing to tell you hard truths.
That's right. And Linda was great at that too, right? She was not afraid to tell me when I was making catastrophic mistakes, whether they were mistakes with the way we were developing products or the way that I was managing the team. She'd even tell me that when I had mistakes managing the finances, right? So she was maybe my finance intern boss at times, which I needed, right?
And very quickly, where's the company today?
Yeah, so I left the company in February. We brought on a new CEO at that time, which I'm excited about. She comes from, she was actually one of the early employees at Genzyme. Genzyme was then acquired by Sanofi, not Sanofi Pasteur, for those of you who don't know. So she stayed on at Sanofi. So she's kind of come on to take up the reins, and the company, kind of our biggest milestones right before I left, we signed a deal with AstraZeneca to develop some mRNA vaccines on the platform, which I'm very excited about. It was a $10 million deal, so for us, it's a very big deal. And then we also have moved into the GLP-1 space, as I mentioned. I can't go into full details on that yet. So we've got multiple programs now marching towards the clinic through those different programs. And I'm excited. I think the company is in a good place, and the individual I brought in to lead the company, I think, has the right set of skills for going from 50 to 200 employees in a way that, quite frankly, I'm not sure I would have.
And finally, this 10-year lease, having rented office space, I totally commiserate with this. What's the story with the 10-year lease?
So the disaster of it is it kind of forced us to then, when we needed more manufacturing space, we kept that space and opened a second facility. And that, honestly, if I think back, was in the top 5 worst decisions that I made. So splitting the team at this early stage was a really, really bad idea, right? And so now we hear on occasion, oh, that's not our job, that's Wooburn's job. And I can't stand that, right? Things like that drive me crazy. You see 2 different cultures emerging at the 2 different sites. You see people who don't, and again, I don't fault them for this. If you've got people who live in Cambridge and don't have a car, they don't want to go work in Woburn. Sometimes we need them to go work in Woburn. So it led to us ultimately splitting the company, which was an epic mistake in my opinion. The good news for us is we signed this. Cambridge real estate was going up for lab space, but it hadn't quite peaked. So we're somewhere, in here in terms of the rent per month. And fortunately, it's come back down a little bit, but we're still at a point where we could sublease the space, and I think at least break even or not lose our pants on it. There were a lot of people who bought or leased at the peak and are in a pretty rough spot. If they do sublet it, they're going to have to, probably take a bath on that. So I anticipate at some point in the future, the company will grow out of those that space, and hopefully they can sublet it without doing too much damage.
Amazing how you make one decision and it follows you for the rest of your life.
That's right. They cascade, right? I should have anticipated these risks better, as I talked about.
Okay, questions? Sir, we have a question.
Michael.
Wait, there's a microphone
Phone coming?
coming.
Michael and Michael, thank you so much. Michael, for sharing your expertise, and other Michael for an amazing moderation panel. You did a terrific job. 2 quick questions. First, what is your position in the company now? I know you said you left, but are you still involved? And then second is, in that growth stage when you're raising that Series A, what was that one thing that kept you up at night?
Yeah, no, great question. So I am no longer involved with Faxis. I served as a consultant for a while to hand things off to support the transition. This is actually something I talked to a lot of my mentors about, people who had stayed on the boards of the company, for example, or had stayed on as advisors, and they said for all of them it was actually mind-numbingly frustrating. Right? You've got somebody else who comes in with an outside perspective, is going to have a different vision for where the company should go than you had, and it can be hard at times to kind of sit there and keep your mouth closed as you see the company going. But sometimes you've got to let it go, right? Like it's not your thing anymore. So that was kind of, I think it's nice for me to separate. I still have a lot of good friends. The other founders, 2 of the other founders are still there. So I talk to them regularly, but I chose to kind of separate myself from that on that front.
Do you still own equity in the company?
Oh yeah, of course. So I still want the company to succeed. Obviously, I think I'm still the largest, single shareholder in the company. So I certainly hope for good success for the company. So great question there. Second part of your question was around kind of the one thing that kept me up at night. Even at 15 employees, the thought of laying people off or shutting the company down was just, it's utterly terrifying, right? And again, a lot of us had started, because it took us 7 or 8 years, at that point I had 4 kids. Many members of our team now had kids, and we had come to depend on Vaxis. So that thought of letting those employees down and letting that company fail, again, I was just so thankful that I had the co-founder that I mentioned that came from the public health background, because I never felt alone in that journey. I always felt like the 2 of us would get in a room and one of us was going to find money somewhere to keep this thing going. So thankful to have him. I don't know how solo founders do it. They're amazing people. I couldn't do it.
Great, next question. Please. Oh, actually, I was pointing to that's fine, sorry. Go ahead, and then this lady.
Well, that's a great segue. So my name's Jetty, solo founder, lifelong entrepreneur, fellow iLabber and NVCer. So
Love it.
I got 2 questions. Don't know if we have enough time for both of them, but let's say you have investors
Keep your questions quick, okay? Because we
strong
want to give
conviction.
other
How do you
people-
discern between good advice and bad advice when the conviction is high? And then how did you deal with questions that, let's say you don't have the deep domain expertise?
Yeah, so on your first question, it's such a good one. You have got to talk to a lot of smart people along the journey to get feedback, and a lot of them are going to be wrong, right? So much of, I will think if there's one thing that I brought to Vaxis, I believed we could do home-based vaccination. period. And we were going to figure it out somehow, some way. That was my thing. And I had a lot of people try and talk me off of that, saying, forget that, that's never going to work, find another way to make this valuable. I was not willing to get off that ledge. So I do think that that's one thing that entrepreneurs have to do is, in many cases, think about a vision. And I think this is the one thing coming from an engineering background prior to business school is, if you give engineers enough time and money, they can solve a lot of really, really hard problems, right? So I just had this innate belief that we could figure these things out, we could solve these things, right? And so talk to a ton of people, solicit that feedback, but sometimes at the end of the day, you've got to hold that vision, and you've got to push for it and believe that that's the future. To the second part of your question, again, surrounding yourself with people like Linda Tussey, who was aligned in the vision. She believed in it. She thought it was possible, but she had 40 years of deep domain expertise. She was the first person I went to for every hard question to get her feedback and perspective on it. We also had 8 or 10 advisors that we had brought on. Build that advisory board early, again, of people who are deep domain experts, people who love what you're doing, and people who aren't afraid to tell you bad news. Get those folks on as advisors as early as you can.
Talking to yourself is a really bad idea in this case. Please, your question.
Hello. Oh, hi, I'm Emma Boris, and I'm a data strategy consultant for female founders. And as someone who's primarily targeting founders at the seed and Series A stage, I'm curious to know, it sounds like when you got your Series A funding, you had a full plan of how you were going to spend that money. For people that may not have a full plan or where it happens quickly, do you have recommendations about how they prioritize spending that money, their resources?
Yeah, so I always talk about the lean startup. If you haven't read the lean startup, I love the lean startup. The core premise of the lean startup is when you start a business, you need to spend time thinking about the core hypotheses that have to be true for this business to succeed. And they're going to look different for every business. Some of these are going to be kind of technical hypotheses, right? We can accomplish X, Y, and Z from a technical standpoint. Some are commercial. But making sure that you're spending time mapping those hypotheses out. And then there is a prioritization effort amongst your team to basically look at the ones that are, you think, either most likely to fail or the most catastrophic to the company if you're wrong about them, right? And so it's kind of that traditional MBA 2x2. You're mapping out kind of for each of these hypotheses the likelihood of it occurring and the impact if it does occur. And I want to go for that upper right quadrant and target the ones that are very likely to occur or we think are likely to occur and would basically shut the business down and kind of work from that quadrant down. So I love the lean startup methodology. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I highly recommend it.
Great. Ma'am, over right here.
Hi, Liz Clark, head of people. When you were getting to that point from 15 employees to 30, 50 plus, you saw all the structures and systems you had held together with duct tape were breaking. I imagine in the moment it's kind of hard to know when's the time to put something more sustainable in place, but what were maybe those pivotal moments for you that had that aha moment of, okay, it's time to change?
Yeah, so I remember sitting in these HR discussions, and every time we'd say, we could hire a director of HR, or we could hire 2 engineers. And every single time, 2 engineers won out over the director of HR, right? And so those discussions were frustrating to me as CEO, but when I sat down with the team, that was always the direction we ended up going. So it's always a game of trade-offs for us, right? I will say we had 1 employee who acted inappropriately towards another employee. And so all of a sudden, there's just this cascade of unsafe work environment, right, which was terrifying. We had done so much, if you looked at kind of the gender diversity of Vaxxus, we were around 50%. Both of our R&D leads were women. We had really tried to create an organization ecosystem that was very welcoming and inviting to women, and we had 1 male within the organization that acted badly. That was the terrifying moment to me. Yes, there's a risk of lawsuits, which in the back of my mind, fine. But the biggest thing was we spent so much time building this culture to let 1 individual rip that down, and we didn't know how to deal with that situation. That was the trigger point for us. Shouldn't have come to that, to be clear. Like, it shouldn't have, but that was the truth for us.
You said, I'm Vinayak Joglekar from ResumeX. So you said that science is unpredictable, and to make it predictable, you presented a very good model where of the options A and B, A goes right no matter, but for B, you had an answer before it went wrong, right? It sounded very good, but in reality, things go wrong in many different ways and it goes right only in one way, right? So for A, there will be B to Z, right? So now which one of the B to Zs you would invest in? And if you invest in all, probably you'll end up losing all the money, right? I mean, so how do you know how it is going to go wrong? I can tell so many ways in which things can go wrong.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll use that same risk mapping we use for those, right? Likelihood of occurrence and impact on the development plan if it does occur, right? And so I think that thinking of those risks and those buckets, and you're right, every time I would use that A/B analogy, so Catherine Kasuda, who was our chief scientific officer, would always shake her head. She's like, you're forgetting about the gray area, right? You've got success, you've got failure, and you've got the gray area. You have to think more about the gray area. So we would try and spend time mapping out those risks. And again, it was those same two axes: likelihood of occurring, impact on the company if they occurred. Let's plan for, protecting ourselves if one of these occurs that is going to, throw a 2-year wrench in our timeline. Those are the ones that we need to be pulling ahead and trying to parallel process. But you're right, science is never quite as predictable as A and B as outcomes. You're exactly right.
So really, it's a traditional risk management approach.
Yeah.
Likelihood versus impact.
That's it. That's it.
Ma'am, question over here? And if we're not getting to your questions, raise your hand really high so I see you. Okay. So next we'll be up here on this side.
Hi, my name is Fabi. I'm actually a freshman here, and my hometown is Woburn, and I've noticed that a lot of companies tend to come to Woburn. So why did you specifically choose Woburn as your second location?
Yeah. So funny story. If you ever come visit Vaxxus in Woburn, it's literally we're in this kind of like strip mall. There's a motorcycle gear shop. There's a liquor store. There's Vaxxus. There's a bagel shop. There's a burger joint. So when we actually took this spot on, the owner of the building came to us and said, do you want to put a big Vaxxus sign on the front of the building? And we looked at it and we said, no, I think we're good. So we have a little Vaxxus sign on the door. We're not sure we needed to advertise. But what makes Woburn really, really unique is probably 90% of the realty is owned by a company called Cummings Properties, which was founded by one gentleman who's now very senior. He's fantastic, by the way. And so he is a giant cheapskate. And I love him for this, right? So here's basically what he does. He bought all the real estate in Woburn, a lot of it in, I think, Burlington, one of the surrounding towns. When COVID hit and everything froze up, this man went out and stockpiled drywall, paint, floor, doors, windows, you name it. So when you go into a Cummings building, you don't get options on anything. They have got warehouses full of this style of carpet, and that's what you're going to take. They've got warehouses full of this style of paint, and that's what you're going to take. But that allows them to be incredibly cheap because they stockpile all this cheap and incredibly quick. They have in-house construction teams. So the lease rate was great, and Cummings as a landlord, I will speak very, very highly of. They built us a facility with a clean room in something like 3 months, which is completely unheard of. No one else could have matched that. So it was cheap, they were quick, and the head of Cummings is just a fantastic human being, in my opinion. Gives a lot of money to charity.
And if you guys go to Woburn, you can see Cummings Park and these buildings that all look pretty much the same.
Yep.
Okay, next question, sir. And we're almost out of time, so keep it quick. Okay?
Yeah, I'm Jay. I'm an entrepreneur. My question is that other than Peter, who invested in your company, how many other investors you have talked with? Thank you.
Yeah, so we probably got rejected by well over 100 investors. So we'll start there. The investors that were around the table, so RA Capital was our lead investor. The round before that, the MIT Engine invested. For those of you who aren't familiar, really, really interesting fund. They're focused on tough tech with long time horizons. So they have a very unique fund structure. It's actually a 17-year fund instead of a 10-year fund. It's overly technical, but what it means is essentially they can bet on companies that are going to take a long time to pan out. So they were our second largest investor. And then we had a host of others, Mission Bio Capital, which is a fund that actually sits above Lab Central and invests in companies in Lab Central. We had a fund called Norwich Ventures, which was a medical device firm. We had a firm that I can't talk about that one. There was a government affiliated fund, let's just say, that I am not supposed to talk about publicly. And there were two or three other small funds. And then we had one angel who participated in our very first financing and every single financing for the 12 or 13 years after that, even though, to be blunt, his first financing probably was not a good investment in hindsight. I hope I prove him wrong over time. So it was a range of different investors, all with different priorities, but again, a lot of rejections along the way.
100 rejections.
Yeah. So that's why you better hold that vision. You better be set on that vision, and you have to have a little bit of arrogance and ego and cockiness, right? Because you're going to get shot down over and over and over again.
If you don't believe, then who's going to? Sir,
it.
maybe this is the last question. Mm-hmm. Right here.
So, hey, Michael, Doug Post, I'm another startup guy. so much, first of all, congratulations, great job, very impressive. So much of the story is about risk management, sort of being pretty far out on the risk curve. Aside from hiring a development officer earlier, looking back on kind of how you manage risk, do you think you missed any opportunities, any lessons learned on the risk management side?
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest risk that I failed to account for when we first started the company, we said, we have this platform, we can take any vaccine or biologic, put it on our platform and deliver it to patients better, right? We assumed that pharma companies would get excited to work with us, to put their molecules on the platform to take products forward. I failed to account for I'll say just the unpredictability of big pharma in that. So we would sign a deal, we would generate great data, a new VP would come in over that group and say, I don't want to do this anymore, and we'd lose the deal. So the biggest mistake we made early on was depending largely on external pharma companies. So the biggest change we made, again, roughly 5 or 6 years into the company, we actually went and in-licensed a vaccine from a Korean company. This was an not FDA approved, excuse me. This is a vaccine that is approved in 60 countries around the world, but is not approved in the US or Europe. They're in, 30 plus million patients every year. We brought that vaccine in-house and we said, we're going to take it forward. So all they've got to do is give us the vaccine. We're paying them for it. And then we own our own development timelines. We control our own destiny. And it's ultimately a Vaxxus product that we're able to take forward. So I think that was the biggest shift. Depend less on external partners, particularly pharma partners who were just, really, really hard for us to depend on over the long time horizons we needed to.
Well, there's lots more we could discuss. I hope that we have inspired you and also terrified you. And with that, thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Michael. Before you guys all head out, we do want to just thank you again for your time, for being here. Thank you so much. We do have a keynote speaker today, 2 keynote speakers, Yvonne Howe, Secretary of Economic Development, and Boston Globe's Scott Kirzner, right here at 6 p.m. So please pull up. Now in this room, the next session is going to be AI Startup, Transformation, Effective Scaling, and Pivoting Tactics. So if that's your cup of tea, stay, check in with us. If not, then the team at the front desk will definitely take care of you. On the 5th floor, there's individuals connecting, startup meetups, things of that nature until I want to say 1:15, and you can come back down here. So that is that. And lastly, for those of you that are in the early stages of your startup career, startup stages, this Friday you'll get the opportunity to share your venture at the Startup Boston closing week. And yeah, check out the opportunity to share your venture, showcase your talents, whatever you got going on, and we appreciate you so much. So let's give a round of applause to our team right here.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, if you're joining virtually, please hang tight.